A strip of declassified aerial footage, grainy, shot from a carrier aircraft, shows a coastline folding into inlets like a clenched hand. The caption reads simply, Kure. In a civilian diary preserved in Hiroshima Prefecture, a young woman writes of the same morning not as a battlefield but as a schedule, rice ration queue, factory shift, then water duty for the neighborhood fire brigade. She hears the first siren and notes the time with the discipline of someone trained to obey clocks, March 19, 1945. Kure had lived for years under the illusion that mountains and anti-aircraft batteries made it a fortress. Yet the real fortress was supposed to be distance that American carrier task forces erased. Here, the riddle begins: what sank without a voyage? Not a ship in open ocean, but an entire naval dream, pinned to mooring buoys and surrounded by civilians who could not evaluate the arsenal city that fed the fleet. Strategically, Kure mattered because it was not only a harbor, it was an ecosystem. The naval arsenal repaired hulls, machined turbine parts, and assembled aircraft components, industrial outputs tied to Japan's wartime economy and increasingly starved by blockade. By early 1945, fuel scarcity forced planners to husband ships like battleships and carriers as stationary deterrents, while air power, once the fleet's shield, had been bled in the Mariana Turkey Chute and the Philippines. U.S. planners understood this: destroy what remains, and you destroy not just steel but confidence. On March 19, carrier aircraft from Fast Carrier Task Force struck the inland sea targets. In Japanese local reports, civilians describe a new sound, not the single-engine drone of earlier raids, but layered engines arriving in waves, synchronized with flak bursts. Technology framed the terror: radar-directed fighters and massed strike packages meeting batteries that lacked fuel, shells, and trained crews. In the women's accounts, the first enemy was not a bomb, it was uncertainty. One factory worker notes that supervisors ordered them to stay at their benches until the sirens changed tone. That delay was policy. Production had to continue, even under threat, because Japan's logistics were collapsing. The neighborhood associations, Tanarigumi, drilled women and older girls to fight fires with sand and water buckets, reasonable against small raids, catastrophic against modern incendiary patterns. When the first explosions reached the docks, the diarist writes of glass falling like icy rain. She does not name the targets, but the harbor itself becomes a character, moored warships turning into landmarks, each one a rumor, a carrier hit, a battleship burning. The U.S. tactic was not random destruction, it was system attack: shipyards, magazines, and immobilized capital ships, targets that could not maneuver, could not hide, could only absorb. The raid reveals the asymmetry of equipment and training by 1945. U.S. carrier planes, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft adapted for skip bombing and precision strikes arrived with improved navigation, radios, and coordinated timing. Japanese defenses relied on anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and fighter units that struggled with fuel and pilot quality. In postwar damage assessments, Kure's ships are often described as in harbor or under repair, which is another way of saying they were trapped by economics. Civilians felt that trap in their kitchens, ration reductions, substitute foods, and the black market arithmetic of survival. A woman's grocery notes, scraps of paper with quantities, become a parallel ledger to naval tonnage tables. When bombs hit the industrial shoreline, they also hit the invisible infrastructure: power lines, water mains, tram routes that moved workers to the arsenal. By late spring 1945, the pattern hardened into dread. Kure's people knew the war had turned, but knowing did not grant permission to stop. The diarist's tone shifts from patriotic formula to practical fear: where to place bedding so it can be grabbed in seconds, how to keep children quiet in shelters, how to recognize the difference between reconnaissance aircraft and a full strike. She records the harbor at dusk, warships as silhouettes, while rumors circulate that the remaining fleet will sortie in a decisive battle. In reality, planners faced brutal constraints. Without fuel, sorties became symbolic gestures, like Operation Tengo in April. That is the hinge of our riddle: the fleet would die not in a glorious open ocean duel, but by being fixed in place, then systematically smashed from the air. Kure was about to learn that an anchorage can become a grave. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. The next chapter in Kure's archival record begins not with ships, but with weather reports and sortie schedules. U.S. planners had learned in March what Kure held. By summer they returned with a larger purpose: deny Japan any illusion of a surviving fleet that could complicate invasion plans or influence surrender terms. In Kure's women's notebooks, June becomes a month of counting alarms, counting ration stamps, counting the men missing from factories because they were drafted or dead. The harbor still looked formidable at a distance, but the logic underneath was brittle. Japan's navy had hulls, not fuel, guns, not shells, berths, not air cover. A surviving civil defense memo describes assigning women to rapid-fire watch on rooftops, an instruction that reads like tragedy in advance, because the weapon coming was not a single bomb but saturation. Coordinated carrier strikes designed to overwhelm response time. When I compare U.S. strike plans with Japanese local accounts, a chilling mismatch appears. Americans discussed Kure as a target set, specific piers, dry docks, and recognizable silhouettes. Civilians described it as a skyline of steel that meant jobs, food access, and a reason their city existed. In one testimony later collected in Hiroshima, a woman remembers the smell of the arsenal: hot metal, oil, seaweed at low tide. That smell mattered because fuel shortages had changed it: less fresh petroleum, more burnt substitutes, more smoke from makeshift industry. Strategic bombing surveys after the war noted how dispersion moved some production into tunnels and rural sheds, but ship repair could not truly disperse. You need cranes, slips, and water. So the fleet stayed where it could be serviced, and U.S. carriers came where the fleet could not leave. The tactical equation was simple: immobility equals vulnerability. By July 1945, the technology gap had become a gulf. U.S. task forces operated with mature carrier doctrine, combat air patrol, radar pickets, timed deck cycles, massed strikes, and photo reconnaissance to verify damage. Japanese defenses in the inland sea relied heavily on flak belts and limited fighter response, hampered by fuel and pilot depletion. A woman working near the tramline to the docks wrote that the most frightening sound was not bombing but the pause after it, when you waited to hear whether the next wave was coming. Her neighborhood shelter had rules: no crying loudly, conserve candles, keep a bucket for fire. Yet incendiaries and high explosives were designed to break exactly such routines. Meanwhile, the ships at anchor, some partially camouflaged, some shifted to shallower waters, were defensive theater. Camouflage could fool a pilot for seconds; it could not restore air superiority. July 24, 1945 arrives in the record like a stamp: more sirens, more aircraft, more smoke columns walking along the waterfront. Here the riddle sharpens: what sank without sailing? In U.S. after-action summaries, repeated strikes are justified because a crippled ship still represents potential: guns for coastal defense, a symbol for morale, a bargaining chip. For Kure's civilians, those same holes were magnets. Women wrote that bombs seemed to choose the harbor, yet their homes were close enough to be struck by fragments, blast pressure, and fires spreading through wooden neighborhoods. The tactical truth: attacking ships in harbor concentrates violence into a confined area, and that area includes workers' districts. Each raid also attacked logistics: cranes, rail spurs, power substations, so even undamaged factories became useless. Warships could be repaired only if the city around them still functioned. The raids made sure it did not. In the days 24 to 28 July, the tempo becomes relentless in both sets of documents: U.S. pilots logging sortie numbers, Japanese civilians counting hours between alarms. A young mother's note, later quoted in a local history, describes carrying a child and a bundle of documents: family register, ration cards, because paper was the only property you could guarantee to save. That detail exposes the economic reality. By 1945, wealth was not furniture or clothing, it was identity and access to food. Around the docks, ships were hit and rehung with emergency lines. Some were already dead in the water, serving as floating batteries. But floating batteries are still targets, and every flak burst consumed ammunition Japan struggled to replace. The raids were not merely destructive, they were diagnostic. Each photo run confirmed what still moved, what still fired, what still mattered. By the time the smoke thinned, Kure's harbor held shapes that looked like ships, yet behaved like wrecks. Archival photos taken after July 28, 1945 show a strange stillness. The water is calm, but the shoreline is bruised, black scars around docks, jagged holes where workshops stood. In a woman's diary entry dated the same week, the most repeated word is not bomb but burn. That is the physics of late-war air attack. Incendiaries and blast work together, cracking roofs and windows so fire can breathe. U.S. carrier doctrine aimed for repeatability: strike, assess, strike again, because ships in harbor can be revisited like items on a checklist. Japanese planners, by contrast, were trapped inside a failing logistics system. Petroleum imports had been strangled by submarines, refining and transport were crippled, training pipelines collapsed. When we say the fleet died at anchor, we are also saying it died in spreadsheets: tonnage lost, sorties impossible, repairs delayed by missing parts. For the civilians of Kure, that abstraction translated into nights without water pressure and days without rice. The human factor in Kure's story is the way women were made into infrastructure. Neighborhood associations assigned them to firefighting, first aid, and salvage, tasks that assumed the city could endure modern carrier air power. One civil defense directive urged quick suppression of roof fires, another warned against panic talk. Yet the raids punished the very density that made Kure valuable: clustered housing near shipyards so workers could walk when trams stopped. A survivor testimony describes women forming bucket lines while sparks fell like insects, and then stopping because the wells ran dry after mains were broken. Tactically, U.S. strikes exploited choke points, power stations, rail yards, crane clusters, targets that turn a port into a machine. Technologically, Japan's anti-aircraft defenses were often brave but mismatched: guns firing without adequate radar direction, fighters arriving late, smoke screens that helped only briefly. The women's accounts, however, record another weapon: silence, people learning not to scream because screaming spent air in shelters. In the naval papers, ships are listed by class and damage. In Kure's civilian notes, they are described by shape: a tall mast, a flat deck, a great shadow. That difference matters. The Imperial Navy's prestige had been built on spectacle, launch ceremonies, uniforms, the promise that steel could protect an empire. By 1945, spectacle turned against itself. Large silhouettes became aiming points. U.S. planners debated priorities: supporting Okinawa, mining, strategic bombing, yet returned to Kure because the fleet's remnants were still a psychological pillar. In a factory payroll ledger, I find a sudden gap: a week of missing stamps after a raid, explained in the margin as evacuation to relatives. That is logistics at the human level: labor dispersal not by policy but by fear. War industry depends on punctual bodies. Raids weaponized absence as effectively as bombs weaponized blast. Kure's women also became archivists without intending to. They saved paper, ration slips, school notices, injury lists posted at temples. Those fragments allow us to map how quickly civic life fractured. Hospitals overflowed, makeshift clinics appeared in schools, shortages of bandages and disinfectant became lethal multipliers. A nurse's recollection from the region mentions reusing gauze and boiling tools, procedures that echo earlier wars, not a mechanized conflict of carriers and radar. Meanwhile, covert dimensions flicker at the edges. Japanese security forces hunted defeatist rumors and watched for espionage near naval facilities, while U.S. reconnaissance, photo runs, signals intelligence, and strike camera film built an increasingly precise picture of what remained afloat. The war over Kure was fought in two layers: the visible layer of exploding docks and the invisible layer of information, where each raid's photographs became the next raid's blueprint. By early August 1945, the harbor's surviving hulks were no longer a fleet in any operational sense. They were damaged assets pinned to a coastline that could not feed them. In the civilians' memories, the most haunting moment is not the blast itself but the return to daylight: streets powdered with plaster, boats overturned, and the smell: burnt wood, oil, and something metallic that clung to clothing. Economically, Kure now illustrated Japan's endgame, an advanced industrial city reduced to improvisation, while national policy still demanded endurance. Strategically, the U.S. had achieved what carrier air power excelled at, paralyzing fixed targets and denying repair capacity, without needing to win a traditional fleet battle. The riddle's answer becomes clear. Japan's navy sank without sailing because it had been immobilized by fuel starvation and then destroyed systematically in its birth. And in the margins of history, women, workers, mothers, volunteer firefighters witnessed the moment an empire's steel became dead weight. The first week of August 1945 in Kure reads like a held breath. Many families slept half-dressed, bundles packed, documents, a little dried food, a kettle, because air raids had trained the body to expect repetition. Yet the harbor was quieter now, not from peace but from depletion, fewer functioning cranes, fewer workers, fewer intact rails. Then came the news from nearby, August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. In Kure's surviving notes, the first reports are confused: a new bomb, the city gone, no trains. Women whose relatives worked or studied in Hiroshima began walking roads lined with evacuees and soldiers, trying to trade questions for answers. Strategy and civilian reality collided. U.S. attacks were now not only dismantling Japan's war machine but demonstrating a new threshold of destruction. Kure's people understood something had changed, even if they could not name radiation, or why the burns looked different, or why the sick worsened after seeming to survive. After Hiroshima, Kure became a place of convergence. Survivors staggered in from the blast zone, hospitals and temples received them, women's associations organized improvised aid, water, thin rice gruel, torn cloth for dressings, while fearing another raid. This is where the fleet at anchor story widens. Naval power had promised protection, but now Kure was absorbing the costs of a war it could not influence. In a post-war testimony, one woman describes lending her last soap to a stranger from Hiroshima because the smell of burning wouldn't leave. Logistically, Japan's ability to respond was nearly gone. Fuel shortages hindered transport, communications were fractured, and medical supplies were exhausted. The contrast with U.S. capability is stark in operational records. Carrier task forces could mass, strike, refuel, and repeat across oceans. Kure's civilians, by comparison, were reduced to foot travel and rumor networks, an information system powered by exhaustion. On August 9, 1945, another shock reached Kure, Nagasaki, and simultaneously the Soviet declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria. In staff papers, these events collapsed Japan's strategic options, and Kure's households. They collapsed the future into a single question: when will it end, and what will be left? Women recorded listening for official announcements on radios that barely worked, batteries hoarded like treasure. The fleet, what remained of it, could not be a bargaining tool if it could not fight. That is the grim logic behind the July raids, to strip Japan of symbols that might support continued resistance. Covertly, U.S. intelligence and strike assessment had already done its work. There was no mystery about Kure's condition by mid-August. The mystery existed only for civilians who saw hulks and smoke and wondered whether the Navy still had a secret plan. The documents show it did not. August 15, 1945 arrives in Kure through the Emperor's broadcast, filtered through poor speakers, crowded rooms, and the difficulty of understanding formal court language. In many women's accounts, the moment is described not as celebration but as physical release, knees weakening, someone crying in spite of years of training not to. Yet surrender did not instantly repair water lines or restore food. The home front economy remained a wreck, ration systems were meaningless without supply, and black markets expanded because survival demanded it. In Kure, women who had served as volunteer firefighters and factory laborers now became the backbone of recovery, clearing rubble, caring for displaced neighbors, searching for missing relatives whose names were posted on temple boards. The fleet's hulks sat in the harbor like monuments to miscalculation, a navy designed for decisive battle, undone by attrition, blockade, and air power that could reach any safe anchorage. Post-war surveys, American bombing assessments, and Japanese municipal records agree on the essential conclusion: Kure's destruction was not accidental collateral to a broader campaign. It was a deliberate dismantling of naval capability where it was most concentrated and least able to evade. Tactically, carrier aviation proved that fixed fleets are liabilities without fuel, trained air cover, and repair depth. Strategically, the raids accelerated psychological collapse by turning national icons into burning targets visible from the hillsides where civilians hid. But the most enduring archive is human. Women's diaries and testimonies preserve details that staff maps cannot: the taste of smoky water, the terror of the siren's second rise, the shame of having nothing to give a Hiroshima refugee, the quiet arithmetic of dividing one handful of rice among children. The riddle, what sank without ever sailing, is answered in full: an empire's fleet, immobilized by logistics and finished by air power, while the people closest to it, often women, paid the immediate price and carried the memory forward.